Today, the word decoloniality and the word decolonize and the anti-colonial and post-colonial discourses are very fashionable. Everybody's speaking about decolonization. There are a lot of conferences, programs. It's been taught at the universities, and it really has become a buzzword. But unfortunately, most of the time, we see that people actually confuse what is decoloniality and what is decolonization, for instance, and don't see the difference between them. And also, a lot of times, they put post-colonial theory and post-colonial studies into the mixture. And as I've recently heard several times also at international conferences, some people are offering to use anti-colonial. It's kind of go back to anti-colonial discourses because, of course, they are older discourses that are more established. And I think that before we start discussing anything related to the kind of former Soviet colonies, let's say, and whatever is left of the Soviet Empire today, we need to kind of understand what is meant by all of these things. And of course, I don't claim that I have the correct answer to that, but we need to agree on terms before we discuss this. So I need to explain how I understand this. To me, anti-colonial is a very important and powerful discourse, but politically it starts, of course, much before the period we're discussing now, like the last several decades. Because anti-colonial movement, anti-colonial rhetoric, we can find already in the 19th century in many countries, right? We can find it in Latin America, we can find it in India, for instance, right? In many countries, in Africa, in many places. And if we speak in geopolitical terms and critically in geopolitical terms, we can also see that anti-colonial discourse is very much a rhetoric of the Cold War. Because during the Cold War, when we have two systems being opposed to each other, of course, the anti-colonial rhetoric is hijacked by the socialist system. It's hijacked by the Soviet Union, first of all, right? Because it's using its idea of international, proletariat internationalism and helping the third world, as it used to be called then. And it supports students, for instance, and invites students from the global south to get education in Soviet Union. So all of this is part of the larger anti-colonial rhetoric, which of course in most cases is very fake, because it's not doing it, the Soviet Union is not supporting them because it's very anti-colonial, but because it has its own geopolitical interests and it's being constantly a rival of the capitalist system. So this is what is happening during the Cold War. But with the end of the Cold War, all of these discourses, they stop working somehow, because we see that actually none of the anti-colonial efforts actually brought any viable results. Because even if countries in the so-called global south became independent politically on paper, they still remained dependent. They have remained dependent, right? And the concept of neocolonialism is very important in that sense. You can be an independent country but still be very dependent, and we have so many examples of that, right? And also when the Soviet system collapses and the larger socialist system collapses, especially in Europe, in Eastern Europe and the Balkans, it also becomes clear that it's not possible to reach that idealized socialist state of equality, of human rights and all that, right? So at that moment, decolonization discourse shifts into decoloniality, and people in several Latin American countries come up with this idea of colonialidad and decolonialidad, as meaning the coloniality and decoloniality. And it's very important, that difference between decolonization as a political rhetoric, as a political agenda, and decoloniality as a process, as a long process of slowly changing our frameworks, the way we look at people, the way we look at the world. And I'm not defending it. I mean, you can criticize this and say, no, it's not enough, because it's not really changing. It's a status quo thing, very much so. Because I think it was formulated at the point of distress and actually a point when the global left realized that they're losing. That from then on, there is only one possibility, neoliberalism. And there is only one future, or let's say it's not even future, it's eternal present of a consumerist now. And that's why some of you may remember that in the 90s, early 90s, Fukuyama writes about the end of history, right? Exactly that happened. Like there is no that duality anymore, no binarism. And that's why I think these Latin American thinkers, leftist thinkers, they are really, they feel that they're losing. And so they come up with these discourses and suggest to deal with epistemology, with aesthetics, with other things, instead of actual political fights. As I think Walsh and Mignola wrote in their book in 2018, they realized that the state cannot be democratized and the state cannot be decolonized. So as a result, you have decoloniality. So you see they are intersecting in some points, anti-colonial and decolonial, or decolonization and decoloniality, but they are not the same. Because they deal not with, decolonialists deal not with the concrete results of historical forms of colonialism, but with that duress, as Anne Stoller wrote in her recent book, that colonial duress that is left when colonialism may be over, on paper again, right? But it's not over in our perceptions, in the way we see things, in the way we interpret things, in the way we teach students at the university, in the way we organize museums, and the way we do everything, right? And that is, of course, much harder to change. It's much more difficult to change than just to gain independence on paper. Then, of course, what is important is that elephant in the room, that socialist system that is never mentioned in early decolonial texts. If you read what they were writing in the early 1990s, nobody was ever mentioning the fact that it was connected with that collapse of the socialist system, and actually it was a trigger of what happened to the left, to the global left. I think that, again, traces of this are visible even today. I can give maybe a very, very telling example. In 2015, we decided to organize a conference in Linköping University with my colleagues, Redi Kubak, who's originally from Estonia, and Suruchita Parbjorket, who's originally from India, but both at that point were working in Sweden. So we decided to see if it's possible to have a dialogue between post-colonial and post-socialist feminists, because it was at the gender department. So we invited people from Eastern Europe, from former Soviet Union, now independent countries, from Central Asia. We invited people from the global south as well. But it was already then clear that there is a discrepancy, because people from Eastern Europe were quite open to using some elements of post-colonial theory, some concepts like the subaltern, subalternization, to describe their experience, because they didn't have, I think, at that point, a tool to talk about themselves in this new Europe, and the fact that they were not accepted or fully accepted, that they had to sort of, over west, and they had to be constantly within this catching up paradigm. And they were still never accepted. They were forever in the waiting room to become true Europeans. They were racialized. So they needed post-colonial theory to talk about that, to discuss all that. And soon also decolonial thought, a decolonial option, started to be used by these people. At the same time, I think, from the start, we can see that Eastern European theorists and thinkers and activists, they were aware of the fact that decolonial concepts and decolonial framework was not entirely fitting their own situation, that they needed some additional concepts, that they needed some additional frameworks, precisely because it's a much more complex situation. If we look at Central Europe, Eastern Europe, Southeastern Europe, including some parts of Russian Empire also, right, and the Ottoman Empire, that's exactly what is the problem here, because you see several empires. You see Ottoman Empire, Tsarist Empire, later Soviet Union, and you see also Austria-Hungary, the Habsburg Empire. And all of these influences are coming together, and they are kind of interwoven in a very complex way. And so to understand that, the colonial concepts in Latin America are not enough, because they cannot describe that. You need something else to do that. For instance, recently, maybe you know, Laura Doyle published a very interesting book about inter-imperiality, in which she tries to work with these concepts. I met her recently, like 10 days ago. It was really amazing. And I mean, although she's not a decolonial scholar, but I think what she offers is much more helpful to understand what is happening today and what has happened also before in Central Europe and Eastern Europe and parts of Russia and parts of the Balkans also. One of her arguments goes like this. She says that, you know, there were all of these empires working together, and also people struggling to survive between these imperial influences. And of course, when later they became nation states, they started kind of a censorship process. They started erasing certain elements of their identity that were connected with the empires that they didn't want to remember. For instance, you don't want to remember that you were under the Ottoman Empire, of course, right? If you're European and you want to go to the European Union. So it's very important to kind of erase that and reconstruct your national identity that would be purely European. And so it shows how these processes were going on in marginal countries or European countries, or in semi-peripheral, let's say, countries, right? And it's very interesting because it also shows you how important these inter-imperial processes are, and we need to remember them if we want to make sense of today's national identities and how they're constructed, and also see their limitations, and also see how dangerous it is to not remember this. And of course, if we look at Russia, it's like a really doomed case in that sense, because the Russian Empire, it was reconstructed and reproduced again in the Soviet Union. Although we are used to reading that Soviet Union was so anti-colonial and helped other nations, you know, all over the place. I mean, you read that all the time in the newspapers, in archives. But it's very, very shallow and superficial, because in reality, when the Soviet Union was kind of brought back together after the civil war and everything that was happening in the early 1920s in Russia and its former colonies, it made actually what I tried to call it in one of my recent works, like a recolonization that was masked as decolonization, meaning that many of the countries that just gained their independence and became young nation states, they were lured back into the Soviet Union as republics, into this fake federation, right? But in fact, they were losing everything as a result. They were losing their rights, their language, everything, identity. And that slow process starts. And of course, you can tell me, no, there was a Korenizatsiya. There was a short period when they were actually trying to build cohorts of local comprador elites, let's say, right? So they were putting these people into the Soviet universities or special Marxist schools, and they were actually raising a whole new generation of national intelligentsia that was very pro-Soviet and that was ready to forget its own connections, roots, culture, language, whatever, religion also. So that was a short period, but then it is very soon replaced, and particularly after World War II, during and after World War II, by Russification, by forced Russification, by the fact that if you wanted to get any good education, you had to go to a Russian school. You couldn't go to a national school because that was like the end of it. You couldn't go to any university after that. So that was also a very kind of, and this process still continues today. If you look at the so-called small-numbered people, as they are called in the Russian jargon, if you look at my own Circassian people, for instance, in North Caucasus, where my father comes from, the next generation may well forget entirely Circassian language, because it's not included in the school program anymore. It's like if you wish, you can take it, but of course less and less people wish to take it, because again, they are busy learning English and Russian because they want to have a career in that country that basically forbids them to do what they want and to be who they used to be. So that is also important. And what is also important in connection with this nation building and how controversial it was in Eastern Europe and in Russia. I think I remember very well a point when I was 21, I think, or something. I was coming back from the United States because I was an exchange student there, and I was coming back. And I remember that moment when I left one country and I came to another country, which was not Soviet Union anymore. I had a passport of a non-existent country in my hands. And I sat down and I started thinking, so who I am in this new country that claims that it's a nation state now, and it's called Russian Federation. It's not even Soviet Union anymore, right? So everything Russian is put forward, and it's kind of, it's struggling with becoming a national identity in which ethnic culture is important, like it or not. I mean, even in Europe, it's still put forward, and especially now. But Russians, I mean, they couldn't come up with any kind of alternative to that. And so I don't think it managed to rebuild empire, which Soviet Union was very much, even if it was not called so, into a nation state. And so those like myself, and there were millions of people like that, didn't have a place there. So we had one choice. We had to Russify ourselves. We had to forget about any connections to anything else. I think for me that was one of the triggers why I started being interested in post-colonial discourses and then in decolonial discourses, trying to make sense of this. I mean, actually, I think there are more people like that in Russia today than anybody who can claim this belonging to Russia, pure Russia as such. But that is, of course, never taken into account. And then I also became interested in what are the factors, like who determines it and how this belonging. Of course, language is an important kind of marker here, right? So knowing Russian and the way you speak Russian, that's very important. But also there are other kind of subtler things. And they are subtler because officially on paper it's not a religious state, of course. It's not like an Czarist empire. If you wanted to belong, you needed to become Orthodox Christian. So many people, they became Orthodox Christian, and that brought them the possibility of belonging, to becoming full citizens. A lot of Jewish population did that, for instance, right? Otherwise, if they practiced Judaism, they were not allowed to certain professions in Russia. But if they became what is called vykrist, so they adopted Orthodox Christianity, then they became full citizens. And in many other European countries it was like that. And now, of course, it's not yet like that. But, of course, your ethnic belonging, your religious belonging, the way you look, is increasingly policed. And that, I think, also is one of the problems here. But another thing that is very hard to even define is the loyalty. Is the loyalty to the empire. And loyalty is also something that can buy you a position, a safe position. So even if you are of a wrong ethnicity, wrong according to this Russian kind of attitudes, and if you have a wrong religion, but you are loyal and you're showing this loyalty all the time, that also can buy you a certain positionality within this empire. So I must say that, of course, decoloniality was not popular in Russia or in ex-Soviet colonies for a long time. It's a very recent thing. And for me, it's very ironic that now everybody talks about that. Because, you know, I remember 22 years ago when I started writing about that, even more, 23 years. 23 years ago, I started writing. I wrote it in several of my articles and books, and I kept talking about it. Nobody wanted to hear this. Because in Russia, at that point, people were fixed on postmodernist theories. They were very much kind of reading the translations of postmodernist highbrow texts. Or if they were leftists, they only wanted to see Marxism and Frankfurt School and something like that, and nothing else, you know. And I remember very well how they were criticizing this and saying that this is essentialist, it's going back to some identity politics, and nobody needs that, and we are all suffering because of capitalism, and what's the difference? And I said, well, you see, we have suffering in different ways. Because if it's a woman from an ethnic minority, let's say of a minority group who is of a different religion, she suffers differently from a white guy who was born in Moscow and had everything from the start, and has all these connections and social capital. These are different things, and it needs to be discussed. But there was no, and all of this condescending attitude. And then when I moved to Sweden in 2015, I started getting really interesting letters from a younger generation of people in Russia, including people from the so-called minorities and colonized people, former colonized people, who were interested in this. They were discovering this for themselves, not only through books, but through books as well, because they know languages, so they can read something in the original, but also through their experiences, through realization of who they are and what are their limitations, and how they manipulate it into certain roles, social, ideological roles. And I saw that genuine interest in this letter. Right, so there is an interest among the younger generation in this topic, and it's not just an academic interest, it's also an interest of people who come from activist groups, of social movements of all kinds. But of course the full-scale Russian aggression in Ukraine kind of froze the whole situation, and so many of these people had to leave the country in order to survive, and I'm not sure what will happen out of this situation. So what I want to say is that unfortunately this awareness of decoloniality came a bit late, and another problem is that nowadays there are so many people who don't even understand what it means, but they hijack this jargon, and that's very dangerous, because the decolonial jargon and post-colonial jargon and anti-colonial jargon is hijacked by hopeless Russian liberals, by nationalists of all kinds, and also by Putin's regime, because you can see that some of these kind of things that are plucked out of the context, you can see that too. And unfortunately, I must say that the decolonialists who are originally from Latin America and who were starting this kind of whole discourse, they are totally insensitive to that. They don't see that it's very dangerous to be lumped together with this kind of discourses. And I'm writing now an article in which I try to explain this, and I try to go back to the original decolonial categories that attracted me, and I think that they were subsequently forgotten by decolonialists, and they need to be revamped now and worked more, but maybe not by people from Latin America, but more by us, by people from East Europe, and by people from Russia, and by people from ex-Soviet colonies. For example, one of the categories is double critique. Double critique is not originally coined by decolonialists. It belongs to Abdelkebir Khatibi. And he uses it in one of his novels, I think, Love in Two Languages. It's in French. I don't know if English translation exists. I read it in French. And this double critique, I think, is a very good concept that we tried to use with Walter Mignolo in 2006 when we did together a special issue of South Atlantic Quarterly, where we had some people from Russia and from the ex-colonies trying to criticize the Russian imperial discourse, but also being aware of the larger coloniality, larger Western, so to say, Euro-modern coloniality. So that's what is meant here. You can and should criticize the global coloniality, of course, which today is connected with the US, with NATO, with all of these usual suspects that we know. But it's not enough. Because we have also this other aspect of this critique that should be present, like the critique of regimes, like a Russian regime or Iranian regime or others, right? Because they are not saints either. And unfortunately, that's what many decolonialists are forgetting today. It's not a double critique anymore for them, it's a one-sided critique. And when they say that it's enough to be against the US, I'm not happy with that. It's not enough. It's not enough just to criticize the US and the West. It's also necessary to see the complexity of these situations. I think in that sense, for example, decolonial feminists are much more flexible and much more nuanced. because they were always writing about that, especially Muslim feminists who also write, yeah, we are part of the Muslim world, but we are also feminists, so we have to negotiate all the time this positionality. And it's a difficult task, but it allows you not to go into this frozen essentialism and binarism that unfortunately many decolonialists or people who claim that they are decolonialists fall into today. So I think that working more with Khatib's concept of this double critique and developing it more in relation to what is happening, for example, in Eastern Europe or in Central Europe is one task. And the same happened with another concept that also I think Mignolo coined long ago, and then we worked together on that in the early 2000s. The imperial difference is important to also revamp and work more on it. Because I don't think that anything serious was written except, again, by people from former socialist countries. And these voices are still not heard enough. I mean, they circulate within their own kind of bubble, right? But it's interesting also, for example, that you organized this meeting today. And when I told people about that, they were surprised because they were expecting to see the usual decolonial luminaries there, right? And I said, no, it's a different discussion because it's more about what can we take from this discourse in order to understand the current situation in Europe, in Russia, and in what is around. And for that, we don't need to invite a Latin American thinker. It actually wouldn't say anything new to us, right? So that is also interesting how decoloniality is dividing now into these different groups. And I should tell you that the most interesting things and innovative things, let's say, or promising things that I've read and heard in the last 5-6 years were coming from Eastern European decolonialists and now from Ukrainian ones. There are really smart people there who pinpointed right, you know, in a very nice and complex way, at the same time not simplified. And so I think that the future of decoloniality lies in the hands of these people, not in the hands of Latin American decolonialists who sometimes just fail to understand the situation and write really problematic things. So that I think is what we have in front of us. And I would say that, yeah, it is a bit late to discuss this maybe in Russia, because I hear this a lot. People write to me and say, how can we decolonize Russia? Well, first of all, it's not me who should do this. I think it's a problem of Russians themselves who should sit down and kind of reflect on that critically and maybe come up with something. But the problem is that part of the Russian identity, imperial identity actually, is that it was always mimicking. It was never original in the sense that all of its imperial discourses were coming from somewhere else. But then it was working a little bit on them and making them more native looking. But in reality, it was never able to come up with something groundbreaking that would be different. Because if you look at the 19th century history of the Russian Empire, it was mimicking the British Empire, the French Empire was, you know, like taking this from there, that from here. Okay, Russification was maybe something, as Benedict Anderson, I think, explains in his classical book, something of a know-how of the Russian Empire. But then it's not that original, I think, that many empires did that. And the same in Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, of course, as we remember, attempted to break through and break out of the world system and take a place outside of it, right? And of course, it was not successful. It was not possible. And so it came back to the situation when it's a semi-peripheral or peripheral empire, quasi-empire, which constantly fights for a better place, tries to carve for itself a better, more kind of profitable place. It never happens. And as a result, we have all of these inferiority complexes. We have all of these strange discourses that are so unoriginal. And that, of course, also connects to a mechanical application of all new critical discourses like postcolonial or decolonial discourse to whatever material they have at hand. And that I find not very promising, I would say. So I think that if a decolonization or decoloniality comes of any kind, it would have to come bottom up. It would have to be a grassroots activism of maybe unknown people about whom we never heard yet, right? And it would have to come like not of theories written and published in Ivy League universities, but rather of their everyday experience and what they actually do to survive in these conditions, you know, to build alternative lives for themselves, to help people around. And that I think what we need to know more about, and we need to support, and we need to work more with these people. And not in the sense of like this colonial academic writing, of going there, studying them, and then writing a book about them, but rather going to their lives and, you know, humbly waiting to be accepted there maybe, and be allowed by them to work. It's difficult. It's very, very difficult, because academic life itself is built along colonial principles, of course. And it's very much based on division into subjects and objects of analysis, right? But still it's possible. And I think that all of us working at universities, we should be aware of these limitations. And we should try to build some kind of cracks and fissures and spaces between the university and life world, the societies, the real people. You know, that is probably for us the only way to learn something about the real decoloniality and real decolonial processes happening today. Another thing, you know, I hear a lot of time now questions like, but you used to be decolonial, so why are you criticizing it now? My take on it is like, no theory these days is ideal. You cannot say, okay, I have a key, I know one theory that can be applicable to the rest of the world and it will work in any situation. It will not work. And there is no one grand big narrative that will explain everything. We need to take into account many complex interrelated things like climate change, like I know these geopolitical cracks and geopolitical meltdowns that we see today. And many other things, you know, enviroclimatic problems in general, and they're all interconnected, and they're all very political, and they're all also connected with the failure of the university, the failure of politics, and many other things. And to understand, even to grasp this, we need many theories. And decolonial theory, which is not even a theory, is just a set of ideas, I guess, it's not ideal either. And I think it's already being outdated the way it was formulated in the early 90s. And in many ways, it's not able to cope with reality. It's not able to catch up with what is happening today and offer an adequate explanation. But that doesn't mean that we have to cancel it and say, okay, well, we'll just forget about it. No, there are some important ideas there that are relevant, but there are also certain blind spots that it's not able to see. For instance, people who are using concepts and ideas from decolonial thinking in Eastern Europe, I think, are amazing, doing amazing work, but they also should come up with their own ideas and more forcefully, with their own concepts, with their own, coining of terms like coloniality and decoloniality, for instance, right? I think the academic world should be more aware of this and more inviting for this kind of discussions, you know, making them part of the more, public space and public sphere so that more people hear about that. So I want to keep it open, and I want here to maybe send the ball back to decolonialists who once said that decoloniality is not owned by anybody. There is not one person who says, okay, I know how to define it correctly, and I have that key. And if you're doing it in a different way, you're wrong. No, nobody can say that. It's a set of ideas. It's a process, not a result. So we cannot reach a result and say, okay, now we decolonize everything, the world is wonderful. No, it's never like that. It's the same with democracy, right? You can have a democratic society, but it's a constant work for you. You have to make sure that it stays democratic. And the same with decolonization and decoloniality. And since it's an open processual thing, I think it's just about our choice. It's about the way we see things, about political and ethical choice. And one last thing that I wanted to mention is that, unfortunately, if we look at critical discourses today, anywhere, in the global south, in the global north, there is this tendency to victimhood rivalry. There are smaller groups that are kind of writing about their victimhood, which of course is very important to write about discrimination, becoming victims, being and traumatized. But then, unfortunately, in many cases, it stays as a standpoint critique, and it forgets about other standpoints. It doesn't make that step and doesn't open up to other sufferings and to other victims. And I think that was very well seen, very clearly seen in the situation and in the reaction to the refugees from the Middle East in 2015 and refugees from Ukraine in 2024, right? So which countries were ready to take them? You can see how these two narratives clashed. Like one is anti-Soviet and remembers all that Soviet legacy of occupation, of gulags and all that. And so Eastern Europe, of course, supports Ukraine wholeheartedly in that sense, because it remembers most of, not all of them, but many countries, like Poland, for instance. They remember that history, and they also remember the history that was formulated by Milan Kundera, a Czech writer who I think back in the 80s wrote that, we were kind of forgotten by Europe. We belonged to Europe, but Europe didn't want to support us and save us from the Soviet invasion. And so we were kind of sacrificed in a sense. And that, I think, also is a victimhood story, a victimhood narrative. And it does not want to listen to anti-colonial narrative, because it says it's not our colonialism. We didn't colonize anybody in Africa or in India, right? So why should we have people from there? And of course, it's very wrong, both of them, right? And they're stuck in this inability to hear each other. Although, if we look at it in a broader sense, it is the same narrative of modernity. It just shows its darker sides and lighter sides. It shows a European side in which the same logic worked of this, bare lives and sacrificing human lives and taking any value of them. And that something worked for many centuries in the colonial world, but just Europe was not aware of that. So I think we need to make these steps. We need to stop being victimhood rivals, but listen more to other people and make this listening and being aware of the other into a political category again. So the other is not an enemy, it's not an essentialized other, it's also somebody you can love. And love should be a political category and a form of politics, which unfortunately is not the case today, because the world is rapidly going into this war against everyone, and all these familiar discourses that we know from Western tradition. And I still think that this is for the future, and if we want to try maybe to construct any ideal future, it would not be a future of nation states, it would not be a future of empires, of course. It may be some sort of coalitions and some sort of very free and open regional coalitions. For example, the Europe of regions is one of the discourses that goes, and also not only Europe, but also other spaces. For instance, if we imagine that the Russian Empire finally collapses, do we want all of these many, it will be dozens of nation states. Do we want, or would it be good for them to be a small nation state again surrounded by more important, powerful countries, as it was always the case in Eastern Europe, right? Because there was Germany from one side and Russia from the other side, so people had to kind of survive on that. So it's also an open question. How do they survive? Do they have a coalition of a sort? Do they have maybe a confederation of some sort to oppose themselves to these forces, not to be pawns in someone else's games? And do we even need in the 21st century such a division as a nation state or something. So all of these are open questions, but in order to discuss them, we need to forget about victimhood rivalries, and we need to start imagining a future, a joint future of humanity and also of the planet, right? And unfortunately, we don't see this in politics. And I'm not talking only about horrible Russian politics or something like that, but also Western politics, because politicians have a very kind of short-term goals, right? They think about how to win the election, and they don't think about what will happen in 30 years from now. We will have millions of people migrating because of the climate change and floodings and all that. Who wants to talk about that? Who wants to start imagining a different, for example, order or international law now, because later it will be too late, because now it's still possible to rethink it, but there is no political will to do that. And knowledge production, the way it exists in universities, also is not helping, because it makes people into narrow specialists. It teaches them how to do things, but it doesn't teach them to ask questions why we are doing things and what is the purpose. So it's this instrumental approach which takes the meaning away from any kind of knowledge. So I'm trying to say that all of these things are very complexly interconnected, and you cannot fix one thing without looking at others. And no one theory can do that. So we can use elements of anti-colonial or decolonial theory or thinking, but we should also take into account what we know about our regions and about the histories and trajectories people had in those regions. And also we need to start thinking together, collectively, about the future. And this is something that I see missing from most of critical discourses today.